What if the dragons that appear in every mythology across every continent were not independent inventions of isolated cultures, but fragmented memories of an actual covenant that once bound humanity to beings of such refined consciousness that they could perceive the threads connecting all living things? And what if that covenant was not broken by war or catastrophe, but by a choice, a deliberate severing that humanity made when we decided that dominion was more valuable than partnership, that the illusion of independence was preferable to the reality of sacred interdependence? In the Gobi Desert, where the wind sculpts sand into shapes that exist for moments before dissolving back into formlessness, there stands a formation of black stones arranged in a pattern that satellite imagery has captured, but that no archaeological expedition has successfully reached, as though the desert itself conspires to keep the site hidden from those whose consciousness has not been prepared to receive what waits there. In the autumn of 2018, a comparative mythologist named Dr. Eleanor Chen was studying the global distribution of dragon myths when she noticed something that her academic training had not prepared her to see. Every culture that possessed dragon mythology also possessed, buried in their oldest texts, references to a time before the dragons became enemies. A golden age when humans and dragons existed in a relationship that the texts described with words that translated awkwardly into modern languages, but that seemed to indicate something like sacred contract, cosmic agreement, or binding oath that maintained the balance between the visible and invisible realms. She found it in the Sumerian tablets that predated the Epic of Gilgamesh, in fragments that spoke of the Ushumgal, the great dragons who taught humanity the arts of civilization before the gods of the sky declared them enemies and commanded their destruction. She found it in Chinese texts older than the Tao Te Ching, scrolls that described a time when the Long, the celestial dragons, walked openly among humans and taught the principles of harmony that would later be systematized as feng shui and traditional medicine. She found it in Celtic manuscripts that the Christian monks had tried to erase, palimpsests, where beneath prayers to saints she could detect earlier writing about the Draig, dragons who served as guardians of the ley lines that connected sacred sites across the British Isles. And she found it in a text that should not have existed, a fragment purchased from a black market antiquities dealer who claimed it had been discovered in a cave system beneath the Gobi Desert, written in a script that combined elements of Proto-Sinaitic, oracle bone characters, and symbols that appeared in no known writing system. The fragment was brief, barely a paragraph, but it contained a single sentence that changed everything Eleanor thought she understood about the relationship between mythology and history. The covenant was written in the first language, the one that predated speech, inscribed in stone at the center of the world where the four winds meet, and it bound the children of earth to the children of sky in partnership that would endure until humanity chose separation over unity. Eleanor spent the next year trying to authenticate the fragment and to locate the site it referenced, the place where the four winds met, and her research led her inevitably to the Gobi Desert, to the black stone formation that appeared on satellite images, but that seemed to resist all attempts at physical approach. She assembled a small expedition, hiring local guides who spoke in hushed tones about the forbidden place where the old powers still dwelled, where travelers who ventured too close reported visions and dreams that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The journey took 3 weeks, crossing terrain that seemed designed to discourage passage, and Eleanor began to understand why the site had remained hidden despite modern technology and transportation. The desert did not just present physical obstacles, it presented psychological ones. Moments when the expedition members would feel overwhelming certainty that they were going the wrong direction, that they should turn back, that continuing forward would lead to disaster. But Eleanor pushed on, driven by something deeper than academic curiosity, a sense that she was being called to this place by forces she could not name, but could not ignore. When they finally reached the black stones, she understood immediately why the formation had never been properly documented. It was not just a circle of standing stones, it was a temple, or perhaps more accurately, it was a threshold, a doorway between the world of matter and the world of energy, and passing through it required not physical movement, but a shift in consciousness that most modern humans had lost the capacity to make. Eleanor sat before the stones for 3 days, fasting and meditating, allowing her awareness to quiet until she could perceive beyond the surface of things. And on the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun set and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, she felt the shift happen. The stones were suddenly alive with light, not reflected but generated from within, and she could see that they were covered with inscriptions in the same script as the fragment she had purchased, thousands of characters flowing across the black surface like living things, and she could read them, not with her eyes, but with a faculty of perception that she had not known she possessed, a direct knowing that bypassed language and delivered meaning straight into her consciousness. She was reading the Dragon Covenant, the original agreement that had governed the relationship between humanity and the dragon consciousness before the separation. The covenant began with a creation story that bore no resemblance to the biblical Genesis or any other creation myth Eleanor had studied. It described the universe as emerging from the interaction between two primordial forces, the force of manifestation, which the covenant called the Earth Mother, and the force of consciousness, which it called the Sky Dragons. Neither force was complete without the other. Matter without consciousness was inert, lifeless, meaningless. Consciousness without matter had no way to express itself, to create, to experience the infinite possibilities that existed in potential but could only be actualized through form. So the Earth Mother and the Sky Dragons made a covenant. The Earth Mother would create physical forms capable of housing increasingly complex consciousness, and the Sky Dragons would guide the evolution of that consciousness, teaching the beings who emerged from matter how to work with the energies that connected all things, how to maintain the balance between taking and giving, using and replenishing, assertion and receptivity. And humanity was the culmination of this covenant, beings complex enough to house both earthly and draconic consciousness, capable of bridging the gap between matter and spirit, between the visible and invisible realms. The dragons, according to the covenant, were not physical beings in the way humans were physical. They were primarily patterns of consciousness that could take physical form when needed, but existed more fundamentally as the organizing principles that governed the flow of energy through ecosystems, through geological processes, through the movements of weather and the cycles of life and death. They were, in essence, the consciousness of the planet itself, the awareness that emerged from the interaction of billions of living things, and they manifested to humans as dragons, because that was the form that human consciousness could perceive and relate to. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. The covenant established specific responsibilities for both parties. Humans would serve as caretakers of the physical world, using their capacity for tool-making and planning to maintain the gardens, the forests, the waters, ensuring that their activities supported rather than damaged the web of life. In exchange, the dragons would teach humans the invisible arts, the practices of energy perception and manipulation, the techniques of healing and weather working, the wisdom of working with natural cycles rather than against them. And most importantly, the dragons would protect humanity from the consequences of our own ignorance, intervening when our actions threatened to create irreversible damage, maintaining the balance that allowed conscious evolution to continue. But the covenant also contained a provision that Eleanor found both beautiful and terrifying. It stated that the partnership was voluntary, that humanity could choose at any time to end it, to reject the guidance of the dragons and attempt to navigate existence alone. The Covenant warned that making this choice would have profound consequences, that without the dragon's perception and protection, humanity would lose the ability to see the connections between things, would forget that actions have consequences that ripple across generations, would develop technologies without the wisdom to use them responsibly. But the choice remained, because consciousness that was forced to follow guidance was not truly conscious, but merely programmed. And the Covenant revealed that humanity had made that choice, that at some point in our history, we had decided that we no longer wanted to be bound by the agreement our ancestors had made. The text did not specify when this happened or what motivated the choice, but it described the consequences with devastating clarity. The dragons withdrew from direct contact with humanity, pulling back into the energetic realms where they continued their work of maintaining planetary balance, but without the partnership that had made that work so much more effective. And humanity, cut off from draconic wisdom, began the long descent into the imbalanced relationship with the Earth that had led to the ecological crisis that now threatened the continuation of life itself. Eleanor read through the night, absorbing the Covenant's teachings about how the partnership had functioned, the practices that humans had learned from dragons, the sacred sites where the collaboration had been most intense. And she read the final section, the part that explained how the Covenant could be restored, and her hands trembled as she understood what was being asked of her and of anyone else who discovered this knowledge. The Covenant could not be unilaterally reinstated by the dragons. It had been broken by human choice and could only be restored by human choice, by individuals who were willing to relearn the practices that had been forgotten, to reopen their perception to the energetic realm where the dragons still dwelled, to serve once again as bridges between Earth consciousness and sky consciousness. The text provided specific instructions for beginning this restoration, practices of meditation and energy work, techniques for developing the dragon sight that allowed perception beyond the material realm, protocols for approaching the dragons with respect and humility rather than with demands or attempts at control. And it warned that those who chose to walk this path would face resistance, both internal and external, that the part of human consciousness that had chosen separation would not easily accept reunion, that the structures of power and profit that had been built on the exploitation of the Earth would not tolerate the emergence of a worldview that made such exploitation impossible. Eleanor spent 7 days at the stone circle, practicing what the Covenant taught, learning to quiet the constant chatter of her thinking mind and to perceive with the awareness that existed beneath thought. And on the 7th night, under a sky so filled with stars that it seemed the entire universe was pressing close to witness what was happening, she made contact. Not with a physical dragon, but with the dragon consciousness itself, the vast awareness that permeated the planet and that had been waiting with infinite patience for humans to remember the Covenant and choose reunion. The contact was overwhelming, like trying to contain an ocean in a cup, and Eleanor understood immediately why the Covenant had specified that this work required preparation, that attempting to channel dragon consciousness without the proper training could shatter an unprepared mind. But she had done the practices, had developed the capacity to hold vast awareness without losing her individual identity, and so she could receive what the dragon consciousness wanted to communicate without being destroyed by it. "We never left," the dragon consciousness conveyed, not in words but in direct transmission of meaning. "We have been here the entire time, maintaining what we could maintain, protecting what we could protect, waiting for humans to remember that dominion was never the design, that partnership was always the intended path. You who have found the Covenant and who have chosen to practice what it teaches are the beginning of the restoration. Not the restoration of the past, for that is impossible and undesirable, but the restoration of the principle at a higher turn of the spiral, bringing ancient wisdom forward to meet the challenges of the modern age." The dragon consciousness showed Eleanor visions of what was possible if enough humans chose to restore the covenant. Communities living in conscious cooperation with the land and with the energetic beings who served as its guardians. Technologies developed with wisdom rather than just intelligence. Civilization reorganized around the principle of supporting life rather than extracting from it. And it showed her what would happen if the restoration did not occur. The cascading collapse of ecosystems, the breakdown of the climate systems that made human civilization possible, the return of the planet to a state that could no longer support complex consciousness, at least not in the forms that currently existed. The choice is yours, the dragon consciousness communicated, as it was always meant to be. We cannot force you to remember. We cannot compel you to choose reunion. We can only wait, as we have waited for thousands of years, and offer our partnership to those who are willing to receive it. Will you be one of those who carries the covenant forward? Will you teach what you have learned to others who are ready to learn? Will you help establish the practices and the communities that can demonstrate that another way is possible? Eleanor knew the answer before the question was fully formed. She had spent her entire life searching for meaning, for purpose, for connection to something larger than the narrow confines of academic career and personal success. And here it was, offered not as reward, but as responsibility, not as achievement, but as service. She would restore the covenant not for personal gain, but because it was the work she had been born to do, the calling that her soul had recognized even when her conscious mind did not understand what it was seeking. She returned from the desert transformed, carrying with her not just knowledge, but experience, not just information, but initiation. She began teaching what the covenant had revealed, gathering students who felt called to the dragon path, helping them develop the practices that would allow them to perceive and work with the energetic realm. And she watched as they, in turn, became bridges, channels through which dragon consciousness could flow back into human awareness, restoring the partnership that had been broken so long ago. The work was not easy, and the resistance was exactly as the covenant had warned. Established power structures did not welcome teachings that undermined their authority. Materialist paradigms dismissed dragon consciousness as superstition or delusion. Even some who were drawn to the work struggled with the internal resistance, the part of themselves that had been conditioned to believe in separation, in dominion, in the fantasy of human independence from the web of life. But slowly, persistently, the covenant was being restored, not as a single global movement, but as thousands of individual and community choices, people in many places choosing partnership over dominion, cooperation over exploitation, conscious relationship with the living earth over unconscious extraction from it. In her final years, Eleanor returned to the stone circle one last time, her body failing, but her consciousness more expanded than ever, and she added her own inscription to the covenant, her testimony about what had happened when she had chosen to restore the ancient partnership. She wrote that the dragons had never been the monsters that later mythology made them into, that the covenant had never been about human subordination to alien powers, but about conscious cooperation between different forms of intelligence, both necessary, both valuable, together capable of creating what neither could create alone. And she wrote a message for those who would come after, those who would find the covenant in future generations when humanity stood once again at the threshold between transformation and destruction. The covenant lives, she inscribed in the black stone, not in the past, but in the eternal now, available to any who choose to remember, to practice, to serve as bridges between earth and sky. The dragons wait as they have always waited, with patience born of consciousness that perceives across vast scales of time. Will you answer the call? Will you restore what was broken? Will you be the one who demonstrates that dominion was the deviation and partnership was always the design, the sacred agreement that governs the relationship between consciousness and matter, between sky and earth, between the dragons and their human kin? The stone circle stands still in the Gobi Desert, protected by forces that ensure only those who are prepared will find it, and the covenant remains inscribed there, waiting for the next person who is ready to read it, to receive it, to choose restoration over separation, partnership over dominion, the sacred reunion that alone can carry humanity and the earth through the crisis that approaches and into the future that wants to be born through those brave enough to remember what the ancestors knew, that we were never meant to rule the earth alone, but to serve as conscious partners with intelligences that see what we cannot see, know what we have forgotten, and offer what we desperately need if we are willing to receive it with humility, with respect, with the understanding that the covenant is not about power, but about relationship, not about dominion, but about sacred interdependence, not about what we can take, but about what we can give, when we finally remember that the dragons were never our enemies, but our teachers, our partners, our kin, waiting through millennia of separation for the moment when humanity would choose reunion and the covenant that was lost would be found again, restored not as historical artifact, but as living practice, ancient wisdom meeting modern crisis, offering the path that leads not backward to some imagined golden age, but forward to a future where earth consciousness and sky consciousness work together as they were always meant to, as the covenant promised they could, as they will when enough souls remember and choose and practice the partnership that predated dominion and that will outlast it, the dragon covenant that once governed earth and that waits to govern it again when we are finally ready to remember what we chose to forget. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.